To start, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining. This is the National PIDs Strategies Interest Group, and this session is called Money, 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 the role of funders in the adoption of PIDs. I should say it's being recorded, so if you don't want to have your face shown on the recording, please turn off your video, but you're obviously more than welcome to leave your camera on if you want. It'd be great if you could just introduce yourself in the chat, so add your name to the collaborative notes, which we will be sharing the link to throughout this session. And there are also captions. If you want to have the transcription captions in another language, you can do that through the ellipsis, three-dot ellipsis at the bottom, and show captions and then select your language. But I'm Christopher Brown. I'm one of the co-chairs of the interest group, and I'm just going to start with a welcome and introduction. So, as you probably know, if you're an existing member, but if you're a new member, welcome to all new members. We have 6 guiding principles which are at the heart of the RDA community. They are openness, community-driven, consensus, non-profit and technology neutral, harmonization, and inclusivity. The National PIDs Strategies Interest Group is co-chaired by those 4 people there. And unfortunately, Natasha can't be with us today. She's in a time zone that makes it very early in the morning. So it's myself, Hannah, and John. I'll let them introduce themselves when they present. And Interest Group, if you don't know, serves as ongoing platform communication, discussion, and coordination among individuals outside within RDA with shared interest. And this comes on from work we did. Oh, sorry, I should just say, sorry. The agenda. So I've got the introduction to the interest group, which I'm just doing now. We've got updates on case studies from Hannah. John will give an introduction to PIDs for funders, and then we have 4 use cases from Canada, USA, Austria, and Portugal. Thank you to all those people who have volunteered their time to present. And then we'll have an open discussion and then a summary and close. So as I was about to say before the agenda popped up, that the interest group formed from a working group, but the purpose of the interest group is very similar to what we had at the existing working group, and that's related to national PID strategies and to facilitate the information exchange between countries, regions that are developing or delivering national PID strategies, to improve the coordination and alignment of those strategies, and to streamline efforts between countries through the RDA. And like I said, this interest group carries on from an existing previous working group, and without going into too much details, excuse me, the working group produced a number of outputs. Those included a guide, a checklist, and 9 case studies from 9 countries. They were published in September 23, and thanks to RDA Tiger, they produced some very nice outputs, making them much more visual for the checklist and the white paper. And those links are available on the National PID Strategies Interest Group page. And if you haven't already seen them, I would suggest you have a look. So although we are maintaining those outputs, the interest group is currently, well, we produced an updated template for the case studies, and we are collecting new case studies and updating existing ones. So that's been the focus of our work most recently. So that leads nicely on to Hannah, who's going to give you some more details on the case studies. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Chris. So hi, everyone. My name is Hanna Herengova. I am the head of the National Center for Persistent Identifiers, which is part of the National Library of Technology. I am based in Prague in the Czech Republic. And so back to the main point, I am supposed to give you an update on the case studies that we are collecting. So as Chris mentioned, in 2023, the previous working group managed to collect 9 country case studies from Australia, Canada, Czechia, Finland, Germany, Korea, Netherlands, New Zealand, and United Kingdom. Chris, next slide, please. And for the work of the interest group, we are still collecting new country case studies. So obviously, we invited the colleagues who provided the first round of case studies to provide an update. And we also identified a few more countries where we knew that there's some kind of an interest in building a national PID strategy. And Originally, we did want to have the case studies collected slightly earlier, but as you can imagine, things take time, especially the things that we do in our free time as volunteers. So basically, right now the current deadline is April 1st. We should have enough case studies, but in case any of you is inspired to work on a new one for their own country, we would be happy to talk about the deadline, and we would be happy to have your case study as well. So please just reach out to any of the co-chairs, and we will be happy to work with you. Chris, next slide, please. So for the case studies that we currently have, we do have case studies for Australia, Canada, Czechia, Finland, which are updated case studies. We do have a new case study for France. Thank you very much. For Ireland, thank you. An updated one for United Kingdom and a new one for the US. Thank you very much. And we are still waiting on case studies from Brazil, from China, and possibly from Japan. There should be a little question mark there. We will see. Chris, next slide, please. Thank you very much. And so, just to give you a little glimpse into what we are seeing in the case studies that we currently have. At the beginning of the case study template, we are asking the authors to self-assess the maturity of their national PID strategy. There are three options: emerging national PID strategy, which is in basically planning and preparation stage; implementing, which is the strategy is being carried out; and optimizing, which is the countries which are really just continuing with their strategy, and basically fine-tuning what they are doing. So the countries that self-assessed as having an emerging national PID strategy were Czechia, Ireland, United Kingdom, and the US. Note that both Czechia and United Kingdom were basically in the same stage in 2023. The countries that self-assessed as implementing were Finland and France, and countries who are continuing with their national PID strategy as planned are Australia and Canada. Next slide, please. Thank you. So basically, what we are seeing is countries that are doing great, and they are making their national PID strategies and roadmaps happen. And we are also seeing a few countries where the preparation of their national PID strategy or the national PID strategy is sort of stalling, or maybe even stopped. And then to demonstrate that, I included the three quotes that you are seeing on the slide. One of them is saying, we were working on the national PID strategy when we had project funding. Once the project funding has ended, there's no high-level strategic support for further work. And the other two quotes are from New Zealand and the Netherlands, who decided basically not to give us an update of their case study because of these two reasons that you see in the quotes. The first one is we just do not have any updates to share on the national PID strategy, and the second one is that the actual national roadmap has not continued as a standalone activity. So basically, it doesn't mean that there's nothing happening in these countries in relation to persistent identifiers. There's actually plenty of things happening, but the actual PID strategy is not necessarily making much progress. So this is something that is sort of the first thing that you see when you start looking at the case studies, and this is something that we definitely want to dive into because we think it can be very valuable to identify what obstacles we can encounter, and how can we alleviate those. Chris, next slide, please. And once again, just to give you a little idea of the content of the case studies, we asked the authors to give us some lessons that they learned along the way, and I asked AI to summarize them for us, just for the sake of this meeting. And so it came up with these five recommendations based on the provided lessons learned. First one being secure strong governments and strategic support. Um, Establish a working group. Work with people who have the money and have the decision-making power. Second one is ensure sufficient resources and realistic timelines. I think this is something that you truly only learn with time. Obviously, you need people, you need money, you need time to build a successful national PID strategy. The third one is engage stakeholders broadly, but for the operational work in smaller groups. It can be more efficient. Fourth recommendation is prioritize interoperability and internationally recognized PIDs. Basically, something that has been already part of the checklist from the working group. Learn from strategies in other countries. Research is global. Work with that, not with a very local or localized context. And the last recommendation is focus on practical implementation and clear benefits, which is once again coming back to be able to demonstrate value to your specific stakeholder groups. As Chris already mentioned, we will dive more into these case studies in the next RDA plenary. But nevertheless, hopefully this is already bringing at least a bit of value. And with that, over to John. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hannah and Chris. I'll just quickly share my own screen here. So, hi, folks. My name is John Aspler. I'm the manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier community at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. We run the PID program in Canada, and we have really been pushing toward the development of a national PID strategy that engages with every stakeholder possible. And part of what we found this last year is that the question of how to include, engage, and get funders to actually implement PIDs into their funding platforms has been one of the most pressing questions, partly coming from funders themselves in Canada, but also just as we think through sort of what the next stages of driving forward a PID strategy in a particular regional or national context could be. So apologies for all the text on the screen all at once, but basically I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how PIDs for funders can help drive, or at least funders engaging with PIDs can help drive forward a national PID strategy as well as PID adoption. And then I'll talk a little bit about specifically what funders can or ought to be doing. So, as I'm sure everyone knows here, every stakeholder has a role to play in the adoption and implementation of PIDs across the research ecosystem, from universities, scholars themselves using ORCID, publishers integrating everything into their publishing platforms, from ROAR to DOIs to ORCID, et cetera, and then, of course, funders themselves. And one of the things we're increasingly finding, again, at least in our national context, is that funders often help drive national RDM policies. Our funders are helping set the stage, our federal funders are helping set the stage for open science policies, open access policies, requirements around data management plan development and creation, and all sorts of other elements of RDM. So funder use of PIDs is one of the biggest carrots we have. I put here the typical sort of scholars see reduced admin burden when you integrate ORCID and DOIs into a national funding platform. Then scholars can have all of their funding or all of their research history and funding history sucked up into the platform, making it easier to fill out, etc. But one of the ways that I think it's really important to think about this is that publishers are an important carrot as well, but so often we see scholars connecting their ORCID ID to a publisher, forgetting they even did it. Maybe they created a brand new ORCID ID for that context, forgot it, created a new ORCID ID later. They have multiple now, or they've done it and it's an empty ORCID because they just had to do it as part of the publishing platform connection requirements. With funders, there's a lot more that is happening right away. If they're successful, there will be a piece of funding added to their ORCID record, just like there might be a publication. And hopefully we actually see these connections being made where a scholar is seeing the value of having their scholarly activities pulled into the funding platform. In the Canadian context, we really only see it as a carrot. And I will talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but there are some national contexts where these funders can help drive adoption because they are mandating the use of ORCID. And there are many, many other national contexts where mandating PIDs is just never going to happen, at least mandating scholars using ORCID. Of course, the funders themselves can register DOIs, they can build the connections to ROAR, etc. But the mandating of someone to connect or create an ORCID ID it's not going to happen in our national context. And I know that it's also not going to happen in many other national contexts. And these are the ways that sort of two kinds of funders ultimately move forward. It's with a mandate or without. For us, it's without. For the last 6 years, since I've been doing this work, the number one question I get from our members is when are the federal funders going to integrate? This has never not stopped coming up. All of the universities want to know because the universities feel this will help drive their own promotional campaigns and connection to the different various PID platforms and PID registration agencies. So funders can help get scholars on board meaningfully, but they can also do more and create their own PIDs. They can register DOIs for awards. This is the emerging consensus and best practice around what PIDs can refer specifically to funding. Although, of course, there are lots of different national solutions, and I think we'll hear about some of them on this presentation or during this presentation. But to speak to the international context and certainly where Canada fits in, there are only about 200,000 DOIs that have been registered period for awards through Crossref and DataCite. Again, there may be others through other DOI registration agencies. So what's really important to understand is that PIDs for funders are new. Obviously, PIDs are generally new. ORCID was only created in 2012. We only started having DOIs for funding through Crossref in 2019, through DataCite, really just beginning of 2025, end of 2024. This is all new, but it truly is the bleeding edge of where we are with PIDs right now. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the Canadian context, what that looks like. But I just think it's really important to understand that while funders in a number of ways can help drive adoption through national policies, through national funding, through adoption and implementation of PIDs into their platforms, this question of DOIs for awards, it's still new and there's still emerging best practices. And so while this is really important and helpful for them to do, there are questions that come up. So what can this look like? What could a funder actually do to integrate PIDs into their platforms to help drive forward national PID strategies and adoption of PIDs in national and regional contexts? The first is to integrate ORCID into their platforms to enable the collection of scholarly activities out of ORCID records when scholars are applying for funding. The second is to collect not just metadata, but specifically the PIDs that are tied to those ORCID records. So the DOIs for outputs and the ROR IDs for affiliations where possible, as well as potentially DOIs for funding if other funders are starting to do DOI registration too. They can also register DOIs for grants and awards and then push those DOIs back into ORCID records. So we're getting that full circle and cycle of metadata across the ecosystem. And there are other little things that they can do too. Funders can push funding review for the peer review of funding applications to ORCID records, which is a really nice way to recognize that unrecognized work. And there are many other elements too. Again, I'm not going to speak to the national PID context, as we don't have any national PIDs in Canada, but they are a really, really important part of this ecosystem, especially in some specific jurisdictions. And there are other new and emerging PIDs that funders are looking at and may eventually consider, like the Research Activity Identifier, RAID, which is a PID for projects. Lastly, and this is a diagram from the folks at MoreBrain developed for us as part of our national PID strategy in the last year. It's basically just a rehashing of what the last slide said, but with a nice image. Effectively, again, when you're applying for funding, researchers and institutions pass PIDs for other kinds of entities like grants, outputs, organizations, people, projects to the grant application system. Funders themselves create those unique PIDs for each grant, and there are a variety of benefits, which I think I've already ultimately outlined here. And this is sort of what that whole circle looks like from the researcher to the funder stage. So we're now going to pivot from talking about PIDs for funders at a high level to 4 specific funder use cases. The first will be mine, so I'll just go right into that. But we're also very excited to have Chris Erdman and Carly Robinson speaking to American work, Katarina speaking to Austrian, and Katja speaking to Portuguese work. We're very excited to have all of them here. So just to give you a better sense of the context of PIDs in Canada, we currently at CRKN, in partnership with our partners at the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we manage an ORCID Canada consortium and a DataCite Canada consortium. You can see we have about 58 members in ORCID CA, 94 in DataCite Canada. There's a lot going on in those contexts, and they are both governed by governing committees made up of and elected by the membership. But perhaps more importantly than that, they share an advisory committee called the Canadian Persistent Identifier Advisory Committee, or the CPIDAC, which is a wide representative organization filled with most of the key stakeholders across Canada who are focused on questions around research data management, PIDs, and beyond. It's composed of all of our major federal funders and several provincial funders. It's composed of all of the different academic library consortia and associations across the country. We have most of the major digital research infrastructure organizations, and there are a variety of other stakeholders engaged. We have the Canadian Association of CIOs and of Research Administrators, and we have a local publisher, et cetera, et cetera. This group's role is the development and implementation of the national PID strategy. Staff at CRKN and the Alliance, of course, do a lot of that work, and we work with our member institutions to implement it on their local levels. But we need this wide and engaged group of people to actually make this happen. Having so many of these kinds of stakeholders means that all of those different stakeholders with their different roles and responsibilities can talk to each other in the same space and can also move forward various strategies and recommendations. It's very easy for this group to endorse and recommend ORCID as the PID for people, and DOIs as the PID for outputs, and RORs as the PID for organizations. But of course, we also still need to work through all of those emerging and increasingly even messier PIDs, like PIDs for facilities and equipment and all of those kinds of things. So to give you a little bit more specific context for ORCID, and then we'll talk about DOIs and Canadian funders. In ORCID Canada, we have 2 of the 3 major federal funders. We have the major Quebec-based funder, which will be incredibly important, as I explain in just a moment, as well as a couple of not-for-profit funders like the Canadian Cancer Society. Also our major infrastructure organization, the Canada Foundation for Innovation. So these are the folks that give, your big awards for a microscope or for the creation of a network for $10 million over 5 years or something like that. All of these organizations are incredibly important to the Canadian funding research ecosystem, and having gotten them into ORCID Canada over the last 3 years has been some of the most success we've really had with driving the PID adoption forward. And maybe just for a moment, I'll jump down to the third point, which is the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, which is the major funder in the province of Quebec, which is, of course, the French-speaking region of Canada. And this is, up until recently, this region of Canada was the furthest behind when it came to the adoption of PIDs in general. And in particular, we had extremely low representation in our PID consortia for a variety of reasons. But then the provincial funder got heavily involved. They sit on this committee, the CPIDAC. They engaged with us on the CPIDAC and they said, okay, this is great. Let's go and do this. And so they jumped ahead of the rest of Canada, and they have a fulsome integration in their funding platform. This is they're now the number 2 connected system in Canada with about 3.5 thousand ORCID IDs connected to it, although very few records updated. I can certainly speak to that later. And because of that, we are now just receiving a glut of memberships from this particular province. So it's one of our most important strategic successes. And this is one of the ways that specifically the funder is driving forward national adoption. We had very little success in Quebec, and now we are having some of the most success we've had in any province in this specific space, thanks to the provincial funder. The other space that we've seen some success, again, is at the federal level. We have these three funding agencies that are kind of one and kind of three, called the Tri-Agency. They represent natural science and engineering, health and social science and humanities research. And two of them, the Social Science and Humanities Research and the Natural Science and Engineering Council, have joined. The Health Council sometimes does its own thing. They are looking to join soon. They also have different software platforms that they manage. SSHRC and NSERC work together very closely. So, all of those fun little institutional quirks of government and the ways in which entities work together. They have the number one connected system in Canada. They have 8.3 thousand ORCID IDs connected to their platform. And what's really great about this particular platform is that it's just a pilot project. It is not their main platform. It is, in their words, the least legacy of their legacy system. So the most able to take development, but it's not their newest and most important modern platforms. So if this platform can do that with just a few key programs, I think we're going to see quite a bit more of this happening as they adopt it into their major platforms. Okay, just keeping the time in mind, I think I have another minute or two. Basically, I also want to speak to the question of DOIs and DataCite and Crossref usage for DOIs in Canada. So as I mentioned, DOIs for awards are new. The registration of DOIs for awards by funders, honestly, there aren't that many organizations in the world doing it. There are 47 organizations doing this with Crossref and 10 with DataCite. 193,000 DOIs registered since 2019 across those 47 organizations, and 8,000 with DataCite, again, since just 2024, but 99% of those come from one organization, which is the California Digital Libraries. So it's new. Again, it's new and it's emerging, it's exciting, but not that many people are doing it. And of those 193,000 DOIs with Crossref, the number 2 global registrar of DOIs is the Fonds de Recherche de Québec, FRQ, with 26,000 DOIs. They are behind the EU, which has 55,000 DOIs as a group. And then following FRQ, it's Wellcome, and I think it's Austria after that, both with about 20,000. Sorry if I got that wrong. Someone can certainly correct that in the chat. I have it in my notes, but I can't see my notes right now. The Wellcome Trust definitely has 20,000 DOIs and is just behind FRQ. So this one organization jumped in. They did DOI backlog to 2019. They registered 26,000 DOIs, and they're now the number 2 register of DOIs for funds for grants in the world. Again, I think that speaks both to the success of FRQ, but also to the state of DOIs for awards being so new. The problem that is emerging is Crossref or DataCite. Do we use DOIs from one or do we use DOIs from the other? The answer for FRQ was easy because they started when Crossref was the only answer before the end of 2024. They're doing this. They're happy with it. And I should also add that their DOIs, almost all of them have RORs associated with them, and a good 4,000 have ORCID IDs associated with them based on those connections that are being made. So, we're seeing some nice PID connections happening in those Crossref DOIs. No organization in Canada is yet registering DOIs with DataCite for grants, but we have a couple of interested folks who are looking to do that work perhaps later this summer, and then we are going to have comparative use cases. What was it like for FRQ to use Crossref, and what was it like for these other funders to potentially use DataCite, and what recommendation might we make, at least in the Canadian context? So I want to speak a little bit to a number of factors that we have been considering. I won't go into them in much detail. I do think that they're important to talk about generally, though. The first is the cost and business model. Crossref very recently changed this. The answer to this question, which is more affordable, was DataCite by a mile for a long time. Our consortium, each member pays 600 euros up to 100,000 DOIs in 1 year. That's 600 euros for a funder to register 30,000 DOIs. It was no contest. Crossref, it used to be $2 USD per grant plus 30 cents USD per retroactive grant. That's now changed. It's now $1 USD for new grants and free for retroactive grants before 2024. So that changes a lot of the calculus. It's still DataCite, but it's only slightly. It's no longer by a mile. Of course, we have a DataCite consortium in Canada, which means we can provide context and service while Crossref membership has to happen directly. We understand that Crossref is more widely used, especially by publishers, and that could mean something different for exposure and integration. And the metadata question is a really interesting one. This is sort of up to the institution. Crossref schema for grants is built to purpose. It is consistent and it is solid, but it is slow and it is rigid. It takes time to adapt. DataCite uses its general schema, its metadata schema, with the new award type, which is awkward, but also flexible and rich. It does mean that they are fitting things into categories that don't always make sense, but it's a lot more powerful because you can do what you want with it. So it's, built to purpose or not, that's sort of what we're looking into understanding. There are other factors in Canada we care about. Multilingual metadata is very important with English and French. Data security and sovereignty, I think, is certainly a Canadian concern, but increasingly a global concern. All of these questions are important for us. So I'll just end by showing a little graph of sort of where we are. This was as of September last year. I think we're a little bit further ahead now. There's 55,000 coming out of the EU, for example, not 54,000 DOIs. But yeah, all that to say, these are sort of the Crossref top minters and the DataCite, all of the minters, at least as of September of last year. Okay, I'll stop sharing and I'll pass it over to the next use case from the US.
Hi, so I'm Chris Erdman, and I'm joined by with Carly Robinson. So she'll join me on the latter half of our slides. But let me bring them up here. So I'm coming to you from San Diego Supercomputing Center, Go Fair US. I also work with ARDC on RAID as a consultant, and I'm an open science advisor still for SciLife Lab in Sweden. So I kind of bridge all these worlds. But I'm talking to you today about, oh, let me go to full screen here. Sorry. To today, to give you a little bit of context about PIDs in the US. I included this nice page from OSTI, just kind of as an overview. But in general, some of the key sort of things coming out of the U.S. Guidance and policy documents and memos are really around public access. So there was a lot of activity around that. And then we shifted to another administration. And so, recently we've had a lot of activity around this gold standard for science. Carly will talk a little bit more about this later. But a particular focus is this national security presidential memo, which really has a lot of PID guidance around it. Particularly, there's a lot of focus around ORCID in this guidance. And then you can see, the pervasiveness of like the PIDs from that point on into some of the agencies. So I'm giving you one example. The NIH is a place I'm working with, NIAID particularly. And this guidance, this plan came down within NIH as far as the PIDs to use, and the guidance that goes along with that. And it's particularly, like that. This is something that we're feeding off of as well when we are working with NIH to advance PIDs through Go Fair US. There's also work at the national level on a PID strategy. Really, it's gone more in a direction, and I guess Carly might be able to speak a little bit more about this too, but it's gone more in a direction of defining PIDs as well. And so, that work is being led in NISO, and there is a session on that later on, as you can see down below, if you wanted to learn more about what was happening there. And then some of the other things that are happening, in the US as far as alignment around FAIR, and that has a lot to do with PIDs as well. So, like what are the different sort of agencies doing around FAIR? We're doing work at NIH. We created this blueprint on FAIR data, and so you can actually see more about that, and a lot of the guidance in there is around identifiers as well. And the same with this just recently came out, and we worked together, Guy Ping and some other people put out some these recommendations for NASA as well, and it really starts going down that direction of sort of also recommending PIDs and really requiring them for different outputs. Um, so I mean, I think the point there is that this seems like a great time to start aligning these things too within the agencies, and we've already heard that. Um, and again, here's the link to the blueprint that we put together. And so, just a little bit more background on this. This is guidance to repositories and researchers in NIAID, but being shared more broadly within NIH. And it sort of flowed into this webinar series that we're doing that's building off of the blueprint. And so one of the first sessions that we held was on identifiers. A lot of caveats from that session with NIH. If anyone's interested, we can talk more about that later. But this is just a presentation that was given to their community to the community recently, and had a sort of a lot of the sort of discussions, follow-up discussions about it. And then, when it comes to PIDs and funders, a lot of there are a number of cases now where the philanthropic funders are starting to, integrate PIDs into what they're doing. One of the places I used to work at, Michael J. Fox Foundation, and then Aligning Science Across Parkinson's, they have one of those sort of more advanced policies out there when it comes to that, and systems for monitoring these things. But what is beneficial is they work within a group called the ORFG, the Open Research Funders Group, and so a lot of these other funders share with each other what they're doing. And ORFG is aligned with Spark, where Carly's at, so she might have a little bit more to say about that. But this was a recently revised open science policy from Michael J. Fox Foundation that I just wanted to share with you as well, as far as how PIDs are advancing in philanthropic funders. And then another sort of case to bring up is we at San Diego Supercomputing Center and Lyrasis have launched a U.S. RAID pilot. And luckily we can build on the work that the Australians are doing. We're not the only ones. I see other partners on the call, so John and Chris, and so there are others here that are working towards advancing RAID, the research activity identifier, as sort of a common identifier that we're using too, and we're very close to launching that fully, around in particular regions, and so. But within the U.S., what's been nice is to hear about all the sort of pilot cases, and how RAID can help connect all these PIDs together, right? So this is one of the cases that I heard as a funder too, is we've mandated all these PIDs, but now we have to link all of them together. We have to make sense of the hairball. And so we're hoping that RAID will help with that. I'm sorry, Hannah. Sorry, I forgot to mention you as well. So I knew there were other people on the call. I just saw you. So and then the other thing that I would like to highlight too is the recommendations towards PIDs for research facilities, platforms, and instruments. And this was also work done from an NSF funded project. The RAID pilot is an NSF funded project as well. And it was sort of building up towards moving the instrumentation PID guidance along further, so we could start leveraging it more. So those are those cases. And I think I'm just closing with, before I head off to Carly, is we're all working towards trying to enhance, to add all these PIDs to the graph, to the research graph, right? And I included one example of DataCite, adding it to OpenAlex. But the local example that we had at the in NIAID and NIH is trying to do this with the NIAID data ecosystem. So leveraging PIDs to interconnect all the data, that's coming out of NIAID too. But this is what we're doing worldwide, and it's it's not easy at the moment, right? We're all trying to work on this and also trying to visualize through monitoring systems, the benefits. I think, John was just trying to do that in the previous slides too. So I will close, and I'm sorry that was so fast, but I wanted to give Carly a chance to have the floor too. So, Carly?
Thanks so much. Hi everyone. I'm Carly Robinson. I'm coming from Spark, which is a nonprofit membership organization, and we support open systems of research and education, focusing on driving policy change and cultivating communities. But I was actually at the U.S. Department of Energy for over a decade, until the middle of last year. And in that position, I was developing and leading all of the PID programs and policies at the agency, as well as supporting other agencies like the U.S. National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health. And as Chris mentioned, also serving on that NISO PID working group. So I will be very brief. If you want to go to the next slide, thank you. So as Chris mentioned, paid usage and policies, especially at the funder level, is somewhat decentralized at this point in the US, especially between government funders and private foundations and funders. But there was kind of a high level push within the US government through a couple of policies under the last couple administrations. Chris hit on these. So one was focused on national security and requiring persistent identifiers for individuals. Another was the OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy White House memo that was focused on making research outputs publicly available. That had focused on kind of publications and data, but had a whole section on persistent identifiers as well. And so, because of the administration change, the focus is now kind of under a different policy, which is the Gold Standard Science Executive Order, or GSS. And so, even though there's still a lot of support for persistent identifiers and public access in the agencies, they're still doing a lot of work in this. They're kind of reframing it under this administration's priorities. And I did provide a link here. I gave a talk on this a couple months back that really dives into kind of what requirements there are at each of the federal agencies so far. But there actually are requirements at some of these funding agencies around persistent identifiers for individuals, often specifically calling out ORCID IDs. There are some requirements around persistent identifiers for research outputs, as well as persistent identifiers for organizations. So it's really kind of getting built into the funding landscape, which is really wonderful to see. I will also mention, since we're talking, John kind of hit on persistent identifiers for awards. So this is something that is still, as John said, relatively new, but it's something that we were focused on at Department of Energy. And so, gosh, I want to say 5 or 6 years back, we actually piloted a DOI service for awards. So in John's chart, I think we were number 6 on the list, DOE OSTI, for the number of DOIs that we registered. But that's still, I would say, very much kind of in the pilot and focused on awards to use some of the national user facilities like supercomputers, light sources, things like that. And then last slide, just wanted to mention some of the work that we're doing at Spark. So we're really working to kind of do more advocacy work around persistent identifier policies, particularly in the US and with the US government. And with that, we're doing a lot of kind of outreach and education to our communities. And so we're also doing a webinar series. PIDs 101 is kind of what we started with, but we have a couple more coming up if folks are interested. One on affecting large scale PID adoption, which definitely can be kind of at the funder high level. So we will have some funder use cases there. And then also another one on global PID adoption use cases, which is focused more on kind of specific PID usage at organizations. So with that, I'll hand it back over. Thanks.
And I'll hand it back over. So, whoever we're handing
Thanks.
it back over to, John.
You're briefly handing it over to me so that I can hand it over to our next speaker, which I believe, let me just check the order here. Apologies, is Katarina from Austria. So if you would like to share your screen, thank you so much.
Yes, I hope you can already see my screen.
It's on the like PowerPoint present. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share the FWF's approach to persistent identifier and our experiences with persistent identifiers. I work as Senior Science Policy Officer at the FWF, and I would like to start with talking a little bit about our open science strategy, because that has to do with our PID strategy. The FWF is Austria's national funding agency for basic research. We fund all disciplines, so from social sciences and humanities to technical sciences, life sciences. And we've had an open science policy for quite a long time. So we started with an open access policy that was published first in 2004. Because of that, almost all publications resulting from FWF projects are openly available. We signed the DORA Declaration in 2013 and are a member of COARA since 2022. We have an open access policy for data, for research data, and the requirement for data management plans since 2019. And as part of that, we ask our researchers, the researchers that we fund, to make their data as open as possible and as closed as necessary, and also to share the data as fair data. And this policy does not only apply to the researchers we fund. We as organization, as a funding organization, we actually also take this as our guiding principle for the way we provide the data, the way we treat data. That's why we try to make the research, the information that we have as a funder, open research information, and provide it as open research information. Why is that important? Why is open research information, open funding metadata important? This is very important for transparency and accountability reasons, and with that, an important element in research integrity in the end. And we've seen that a lot of different initiatives, especially also in the last year, papers were published regarding that. For instance, the International Science Council wrote this position on research funding transparency. Then there was this declaration declaring funding sources for research by COPE. And together with my colleague Hans de Jonge from NWO and Zoe Ancillon from the French National Funding Agency, I also published a blog post where we described why open funder metadata is essential for true research transparency. So we believe that it is really necessary to make sure that funding information is not kept behind a wall, but is actually openly available. And not just openly available, but with PIDs openly available. So what has the FWF done in the last years? And what is our strategy regarding PIDs? We try to implement or include PIDs as much as possible in our own data. We do have the Research Radar platform. You can find that on our website. The Research Radar is basically a search engine, and you can search for all FWF funded projects dating back to 1995. And every time we approve funding, the new project will be added to this platform. We also actually published last year, at the end of last year, our Research Radar archives. There you can find all information on FWF funded projects between 1974 and 1994. Important to notice that the FWF was founded in 1968. That means almost all FWF funded projects are now published online. All the information is published online and is very transparent. And I'm very happy to say that later this week, we are going to publish our Open API, FWF Open API, where we are also going to share all this data that you can now find in the Research Radar. I have to say only in the Research Radar, not the archives. But all the data from the Research Radar will then be also available via our Open API. So let's have a look a little bit closer into the Research Radar. So this is the platform. It's, as I said, a search engine-like. And if you go into more detail, if you click on a certain project, you will find this information. You can find the basic metadata there. So it's the title, it's the PI, the funding program, status, etc., and then abstract and so on. But what you can also see there is PIDs. You can see on the one hand the ORCIDs for every researcher, for all the PIs. We've collected ORCIDs since 2016, and we've mandated ORCIDs since 2016. So we have a quite rich data on ORCIDs in our database. We also use RORs, so ROR IDs, for all the research institutions in our data. And since 2023, we mint DOIs for grants. So we have grant DOIs and use them as our grant ID. We don't have other grant IDs anymore. For us, the grant DOI is the ID, the grant ID. That means we are registering the DOIs with Crossref, and that means that all this data is now available in the Crossref database. So again, what we want to do with the reason why we use PIDs is because we think if there are international standards in place, why not use them to make our own data interoperable and help others being able to use our data. So again, we've had the ORCID requirement since 2016, and I'm a member of the Austrian ORCID Consortia. We use Crossref Grant DOI since 2023. And also, it's important to note that we are registered grant DOIs for all the projects in the research radar. That means for all the projects since 1995 now have a grant DOI that is their grant ID. That also means that what we also changed with the implementation of the grant DOIs is we changed our acknowledgement requirements. So when a researcher funded by the FWF now acknowledges the FWF and the project, they have to use the grant DOI. It's not the grant ID anymore, but the DOI, because we hope with that in the future, it will be much easier for us as a funder to be able to connect outputs with funded projects. Again, I mentioned that already, we are also using raw IDs. This can be very helpful, especially now when we start sharing our data via our API from this week onward. We hope that this will then also help the research organizations in Austria and beyond to connect their CRIS systems, their repositories with our data, with the funding data, to make sure that that researchers don't have the burden to connect these information, but that we as funders and organizations can help them just to connect the funded projects and the outputs. Yeah, and with the outputs that we collect, with them, the outputs usually have DOIs or other persistent identifiers. So we also have these persistent identifiers in our data. This is already my last slide, and I just wanted to mention that the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information, there is a dedicated working group on funding metadata that I'm chairing together with Hans de Jonge from the Dutch Research Council and Zoe Ancien from the Agence Nationale de la Recherche. And we are working on different task forces and actions that we're working on. But basically what we are doing is we really want to connect with other funding agencies and talk about how we as funders can make our data, our own data, as open as possible and as close as necessary, how we can use PIDs. And to do so, there were already some actions and more is going to come in the future. But I just wanted to mention that there was last fall, there was a roundtable with publishers and infrastructure providers and funding agencies talking about the quality of the metadata that is in outputs, that is currently in outputs publications. The quality is not that good. So what we see is that the information about the funding information in the acknowledgement sections, they are not in the metadata. They cannot be the funding information cannot be seen in the metadata then. So this is a problem if you want to link information if the funding information is actually not there. So what we are trying to do, or what we are actually currently working on in this working group, is to create information material for funders that are interested in the topic of open research information in PIDs and make resources, different kinds of resources available to them. So in the next 2 weeks, I hope we will publish an information website or a website with information about open funding metadata, where we explain what it actually is, what the benefits of open funding metadata are, and what the benefits for the different stakeholders are. And we hope that can help different funders to have their arguments in one place, and when they talk with their leaderships to be able to have these arguments by hand. Yes, and we are already planning more activities. So I just wanted to say, if there are funders here in the call or others that are interested in joining this group, we are a very open group and happy to have people join. So that's from my side. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing again.
Thank you so much. Really great presentation. I don't think I've seen most of that before, so I was very excited to learn a lot of what you presented there. So we'll be moving on to our last use case before we move into the discussion section, and this is presented by our colleague from Portugal. Apologies, let me up the slides.
I'll share the screen now, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Katia. There we go.
Thank you. Okay. So I think you should be able to see my slides now. Can you confirm that, please?
Yes, it's on the PowerPoint, like it's not the full slide view.
Now it's
there we go.
The right
you got it.
So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to speak today. My name is Katia Laranjeira. I manage PIDs, the National Program for Research Information Management and Interoperability, coordinated by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, or FCT. So let me just start with a bit of context. FCT plays a dual role in the Portuguese research ecosystem. On one hand, it is the main national funding agency supporting researchers, projects, institutions in all discipline domains, therefore generating a large amount of research information. But on the other hand, through its digital services unit, FCCN, it also provides key digital infrastructures and services to the scientific community. It is precisely at this intersection between funding, infrastructure, and information that PIDs was launched in 2015 with three major goals: to simplify research information management, to allow for more precise measurement of research activity, and to facilitate access to that same research activity aligned with the open science principles. To achieve these goals, PIDs adopted a strategy that is not by creating a single system, but rather building an interoperable ecosystem, a framework that allows information to just flow smoothly across the many platforms used in the research lifecycle. And this pyramid tries to represent exactly that. So it represents the different layers required to support this ecosystem, from the identifiers and standards to the interoperable systems, and ultimately to the services that benefit researchers, institutions, and funders. So the key approach, or the key element of this approach, is the adoption of persistent identifiers, which allow information about researchers, organizations, funding, and outputs to be reliably connected and exchanged across the ecosystem. And just let me briefly show you in the next slides how the PID stack supports the PIDs approach. So when it comes to researchers, our goal was obviously to know exactly who is who in the scientific ecosystem. And to this end, we have adopted the Ciência ID Plus, Science ID Plus, which brings together two persistent identifiers. We have, on one hand, Ciência ID, our national PID for researchers that aggregates all personal information required to access national science services. And this means that researchers can use a single authoritative profile instead of repeatedly entering the same data across different systems. But we also have ORCID, and this is because obviously science is global, and so we need an identifier that travels with researchers wherever they go. Portugal is in fact a world leader in ORCID adoption, with around 70% of our national researchers using it. And this is actually one of the highest rates in the world, as shown here in this graph, which I took from a study from digital science. So together, these identifiers give us a clear, reliable way to connect people to their contributions, both nationally and internationally. Anyone registering for a CNC ID is encouraged, although not required, so it's encouraged to link their ORCID account. And when they do so, part of their personal information is automatically imported from ORCID, and their ORCID ID becomes part of their PTCRIS identity. And this means that anytime they use CNC ID to log into systems such as the FCT application platform, or CNC Vitae, which is the National Curriculum Management Platform, their ORCID ID will just travel with this information and is populated automatically as shown here. And this means also that the researchers, and this is the carrot, researchers can from that point onwards use the ORCID importer to maintain their data synchronized between the two platforms, ORCID and CNC Vitae, simply by clicking a button. But knowing who people are is only half of the story, of course. We also need to know exactly which institutions researchers belong to. And to do that, PTCRIS has adopted the ISNI Plus system as its reference authority. This system includes over 600,000 organizations worldwide, including more than 3,600 Portuguese R&D institutions. And in practice, researchers just have to select their institution from this authority registry, ensuring that from that point onwards, their affiliation is linked to a unique and interoperable identifier across the system. But as the landscape evolves, PTCRIS also started preparing a transition from ISNI Plus to ROR. So we began by identifying the challenges, gaps, and risks associated with the potential transition. This includes from coverage issues to alignment with the requirements of the PTCRIS services. And over the past year, we have been working with the ROR team to ensure an increased representation of the Portuguese R&D organizations in the registry. And this has indeed happened. So we have reached now 48% when it comes to representation of the Portuguese organizations in the ROR registry. So this is a very positive trend, but coverage is not as yet sufficient for a full transition. So for the time being, we are sticking to our evidence-based approach before adopting ROR as our primary reference. So let me now turn to funding, because obviously if we want a fully connected research ecosystem, funding information needs to be precise, traceable, and discoverable, as mentioned before. And so in 2023, we launched a national pilot with Crossref to register grant DOIs for FCT funding. This was possible, and someone was mentioning on the chat the difficulties that are associated with infrastructure and technology to actually have funders registering DOIs. And so I totally agree. So this work was possible because we had done groundwork developing a national registry for funding information, CyProj, where funding instruments had already been mapped and their metadata harmonized. So by the end of the pilot, we had minted around 6,000 grant DOIs. And in 2024, we moved to full operation and registered over 5,000 new grant DOIs, bringing DOI attribution into our regular workflows. And in the past year, we even exceeded that number with continuous growth as more instruments and cycles are incorporated. All this information and every grant DOI resolves to a landing page in the CyProj portal. it's a sibling from the research radar we just heard, where up-to-date metadata is made publicly available. All this information is also exposed through through APIs that allow other systems such as OpenAir or the OECD's FundStat database to discover and reuse funding information. And obviously, this is where the real value of PIDs emerges. And to finalize, when it comes to research outputs, FCT also provides a service that enables institutions to mint DOIs for publications. And this is done through a national service operated by FCT, which enables research organizations to register DOIs for their outputs. So the idea here is that by providing this shared framework aligned with international standards, we promote DOI adoption. So just to conclude, the work that I shared today with you reflects this idea that persistent identifiers are indeed the backbone for an interoperable research information ecosystem. This is what has enabled PTCRIS to move from isolated systems to a truly connected ecosystem. And this is also what has allowed us to build a new generation of services that I didn't have time to speak today, but these are tools for analysis, discovery, monitoring, and evidence-based decision-making, such as Ciência em Números or Science in Numbers, and the upcoming research portal. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Katia.
Sharing now.
So no point in sharing the slides right now because we've now moved into the open discussion section. So thank you all to all of our speakers, Katarina, Carly, Chris, and Katia, as well as, of course, Hannah and Chris, my co-chairs. There's one question in the chat I think that's worth asking out loud. There have been lots of discussions during the presentation. It's to Katia directly. What challenges are there in registering RORs for more Portuguese organizations?
We have encountered a major challenge that has to do with the scope. So ROR is focusing on level 1 organizations, so universities and research centers. And we have been developing services that rely on having more granularity. So we need also to know which faculties the researchers belong to and what are the outputs that are associated with a specific faculty. So this is information that our community is already using with the mechanisms that we have in place, and the transition to ROR we would not be able to give that same information. So that's a major issue. We have been working closely with ROR. This is still an issue on the table, but we are now working on having as much as Portuguese organizations represented in the registry, and also to work with ROR to guarantee that the metadata is correct, is precise, because we also find some URLs that are not correct, or some addresses, so we are now working on having working on the quality of data. But the issue that I mentioned is the main roadblock at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Katia. Okay, with that, let's open up the discussion. We've got about 15 minutes. If folks want to chat with each other, ask questions, I'm happy to moderate questions as needed. But yeah, just please, what are you all thinking about? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there was a question from Judith for Katarina, I believe. She says, I would love to hear more about the papers and posts to which Katarina participated about funders, PIDs, and open metadata supporting increasing research integrated through funding transparency. Were you able to collect evidence in that sense that observation is a super strong incentive for using more PIDs? So that was a question for Katarina. Sorry if I read it too quickly.
Yeah. So I already posted some of the links to the posts in the chat also. I hope that already can help them. So what we saw is, and I hope I just have to read the question again. So what we saw is that the PIDs for us as FWF really help us identify outcomes and really help also researchers. So the grant DOIs, especially the grant DOIs, when we implemented them in 2023, we saw that the researchers really supported this step because they now have this official link to the grant information, not just a grant ID, but a link to our website where they can then share the information about the grant. They can put this in the CV, etc. The documents, and I just saw now also that Rocio mentioned them and put the links into the chat. They are about the International Science Council and also the blog post that we wrote about the open funding transparency. Perhaps I can say some more words about that. This was really done because we thought it is essential to acknowledge funding information in an output. But what is even more important is that the metadata also includes the grant information. And that's what we wanted to make sure in this blog post, that grant information is seen as valuable information in the metadata and not only as something that is written in text. Because yes, it is important to be written in a text and acknowledged in a text, but it is as important information as metadata. So what we are trying to do and what we tried to do also with the Barcelona Declaration, this workshop that we had last year, is to talk with the different communities, especially with publishing communities, with publishers, to try and find solutions to make the quality of the funding metadata better. Because what we see is that there is not enough, that the information is there in the acknowledgement sections, but it's not in the metadata. And if it's not in the metadata, then the connections between the information, between the outputs and the projects cannot be made. So this is something we are currently working on with the Barcelona Declaration Working Group to find ways of making the quality of the metadata better. And there will be an action plan published soon in the next weeks or month, I would say, where we talk about what needs to be done to make sure that the metadata gets better.
Thank you. Hi, this is Judith speaking. You've just answered my question, Katarina. Is it okay if I just come up with a follow-up question right now?
Do it.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks so much. So thanks for those references and for those insights. I understand completely the added value of funding PIDs thanks to those presentations. My follow-up question would be about how at FWF you are dealing with funding diversity, because implementing it at a national level will cover likely the grant metadata information from the national funder itself, or maybe from other local funders. But how do you deal with different metadata standards for other major funding sources for researchers in Austria? For example, in your case, I'm thinking about Horizon Europe maybe, or other grants that could take place in your ecosystem.
Yeah. So as I said in the beginning of my presentation, the FWF is Austria's national funding agency for basic research. So we only have two other funders in Austria. There is one for more applied sciences and a smaller one, or some smaller ones, a few other ones. But we as an organization decided to implement the PIDs. So this is not really a national strategy in that sense, but we as a national funding agency decided to do that. And for other funders, we try to talk with them, share our experiences, and make sure that others also start registering the grants. And I think that's why it's important to register the grants with existing platforms such as Crossref or DataCite to make sure to use these standards that are already there for sharing the information.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for your answer.
All right, I see some hands from Chris and then Hannah. Go for it.
Oh, were you? I'll go first. So I'm just curious. Have any of the national PID strategies like addressed local identifiers? Because I see like we're kind of like I have the visual of the iceberg in the water, and this is like the tip of the iceberg, and then local identifiers are like the iceberg itself, like and because this came up with our work with NIH, and like it is pretty common in sciences to have sort of these local identifier schemes. So I'm wondering, like, have any of the national PID strategies addressed that, and like, is that a next step?
Maybe I can just say from Canada's perspective, it could be. I think we've seen some clear examples of the need for that, the importance and value of that. I guess it depends on what you think a persistent identifier is, right? All of our grants in Canada have their own local numbers, but those numbers don't matter. They're just internal numbers for the grant agencies to track stuff. As they create DOIs, they may or may not connect them to these numbers. They may or may not value them. They're just not that important. They don't do any of the things PIDs do. They're not interoperable. They're just tracking numbers for the funders. And as they register DOIs, those will also become tracking numbers for the funders with the interoperability. But some local contexts and some regional and national contexts, of course, have meaningful national persistent identifiers or identifiers so close to PIDs that they need to start interacting with and connecting to and become interoperable with other PIDs. So that's certainly my perspective on where we are in Canada. I don't think it's an urgent or even really a question for us at all, but I understand and see that it's an important question for others, which is something I think we'll want to think about when we're looking at and analyzing those use cases. I see Carly and then Maria.
Yeah, so in the US context, I do think that this is an interesting and important question, particularly with some of the NIH data repositories, for example. The US government does have a definition of what a persistent identifier is, and I would say um, uh, it's not always what other folks think of as a persistent identifier. It's maybe has more specific definitions included. But I will say I have had conversations with some folks at NIH and then kind of more globally about accession numbers, right? So accession numbers can be very heavily used within certain communities. And so we're talking about kind of shifting culture as opposed to the infrastructure, because I think it could be relatively straightforward infrastructure wise to turn those into a persistent identifier by the US government definition, but culturally, right, those accession numbers are heavily cited and used. And so there's been some interesting conversations about like, could there be some kind of transition where those accession numbers, people continue to use them, but that number is actually turned into a persistent identifier so that it's resolvable, global, things like that. And then maybe there's a next step where, that community maybe starts using DOIs or another type of kind of persistent identifier in the future. So I think that's a really important conversation, Chris. It's also something that's come up in the NISO working group, as you are probably familiar. So not that we have specific answers yet, but appreciate you raising it.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in to the same basically. And of course, my perspective is heavily filtered through DataCite lens as a DOI registration agency. But what we always say is that DOIs are complementary to the local identifiers. And the idea is that you can use both and you can connect them. And through these connections, you basically achieve both. You can continue using something that within your system is well established, is well adopted, but also enjoy the interoperability with the global system by connecting that PID with the DOIs, which are used throughout other systems. And also to kind of reference that, in my previous role, I was part of a literature database that was working very closely with a group of research funders who wanted to track their outputs. And the service that we provided for them was exactly going through the acknowledgement text, text mining these accession numbers, these local grant identifiers, and then matching them to the information that the funders shared with us. And it can be exceptionally difficult, and without really connecting with the publisher systems and capturing this information properly. I mean, the cases we've seen where somebody might even say, we've not been funded by this specific grant. Like the complexity of how researchers really put this information into the text makes it so much more difficult, when we could really be just having systems talking to each other and using this in the background without the human error that can later happen downstream.
Thanks, Maria. Go ahead, Chris.
No, just to follow up, is that yeah, I think it's kind of interesting when you get down to this local identifier space and try to look at PIDs and how they're defined and say, okay, how, because like you'll even see some variations in how PIDs act, like, and so I guess that, that's the definition work that's happening in the NISA group, which would be really helpful, I think, because like that's one of the things that sort of you have to wrangle with is, well, what's a PID? And, like they all have different sort of v variations, like, and so that kind of leaves the door open to, sometimes researchers saying, well, what I'm doing is a PID too, right? And we've had that interaction with them, like that, and so like, having sort of a clear definition would be like great to point to. So.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You're making me think. So there's a document that we developed as part of our national PID strategy, thanks to the work again of More Brains, called the PID Matrix. We mentioned it in 2024 at PID Fest. It was in production, and there was quite a bit of international interest. We wound up having an unconference session on it for folks going to PID Fest this year. We are planning on submitting an abstract on it. So let me just share the document. It's a public document. It is a static public document, but it is a viewable public document. It's a Google Doc with a whole range of features. Now, this is different work than, I know that the folks in the US at NISO, for example, are developing a definition of a PID through their sort of PID strategy working group, or I'm sorry, I'm not sure what it's called, but through that group at NISO. And this document does not define a PID. It does through sort of, so as part of our PID strategy development, we developed a series of principles to guide that work. Things like open source and open infrastructure as much as feasible, stuff like that. So based on those categories, or principles, we drove down a lot deeper into governance, community, and all kinds of sustainability, all kinds of categories. So, Chris, just to speak to your point, the way that each PID registration agency works is different, and so this document really is a document that helps us make justifications. And to be completely transparent here, we don't have many PIDs for people. For example, we have ORCID and we have Scopus, and Scopus is not specifically something we ever considered adopting. It was the sacrificial lamb of a proprietary PID to be compared to ORCID, to explain why ORCID is the PID of choice for Canada and is the open tool that we will absolutely be using and will not be using, or at least, recommending the use. Folks can keep using Scopus, obviously, but we're not recommending that as the, PID for people in Canada as part of the national strategy. So that's true. ISNI is too. Thanks, Tristan. That's part of the conversation around people as objects in like historical people and stuff like that. So there's obviously nuance there too. But for current research scholars, it's that. So all that to say, I think when we think about something like local PIDs, one of our challenges is like an employee number does nothing, right? It really says nothing except for an HR system. And is that meaningful to connect it to? It's not even supposed to be public, really. Is that meaningful to connect it to a PID platform? And maybe local grant identifiers are. And we see again in some cases that these local PIDs, when they're developed as PIDs or whether they're seen as important, can be. And just for us at this stage, I don't see them as being that. But we do have this document that certainly I'd recommend folks take a look at. Part of what we're aiming to pitch for PIDFest is an actual workshop where we'll sort of say, now, what do you need? Because this was developed for us in our local context. And clearly what I'm hearing here is that there are lots of folks in different contexts that have different needs. And maybe there are ways to adapt this tool for your own local context, or to make it broader or address some international needs as well. I'm seeing a question in the chat that I'll throw off to the group here, and then I think we basically have 7 minutes left, so this will be the last question. We'll just do a quick summary at the end. From Aline, what are your insights, advice about PIDs for research infrastructures, instruments, facilities, platforms in the PID ecosystem? How advanced is the reflection implementation from your national perspective? Just very quickly, myself to answer, very limited. This is a very messy space. In Canada, we do not have a lot of thought about it. We are engaging in the interest groups around the world that are thinking about these questions, the PIDinst interest group at RDA, some international use cases we're following. There's a group in Colorado, I think, that has a 3-year project they're working on. But anyway, let me pass it over to others who are thinking about this.
Maybe I'll just mention the U.S. Department of Energy has been thinking a lot about this in the context of the user facilities that they provide. So I've mentioned this already, but they're kind of the national facilities that anyone can apply to use. So these are things like the supercomputers, light sources, neutron sources, synchrotrons. And so with that, they're thinking about kind of the levels at which to assign persistent identifiers, and that includes everything from a ROR ID for the facility, but then a DOI for the beamline, a DOI for the instruments on that beamline, and then DOIs for kind of the data packages coming off. And so I wouldn't say that they have everything figured out, but there's been a lot of really good conversations kind of in that user facility community. And although there's a lot of conversation happening in the U.S. context, there's also, I think, been some global conversation with some of the PID organizations around user facilities. There was a great working group for a long time at ORCID, and I was trying to remember, there might be one in DataSite as well, maybe Crossref. But I think the kind of user facility community are thinking about these things as well.
Yeah, and just I mean, this actually could be done. Like it goes way back. You could search for this, but like PID for instrumentations, PIDs for instruments goes way back in astronomy. And I actually presented at the IAU about it like a long time ago. And so astronomy actually has they've done a lot of indexing, towards the instrumentation that's being used, and could assign, like once this is available, like if there is some global system. And from what I understand is they do have the schema available in the PIDINS group, and like that'll be sort of implemented, like I think it, data site, right? And so like I think that will be like a really something that we can probably, leverage very soon. But I also just wanted to add another use case here based on what Carly was saying at DOE, is that um, it also reminds me of what we were thinking about at SciLife Lab in Sweden, which is using raids as a way to sort of manage projects and then all the resources with them, right? So like you can think about assigning a project on an identifier from the start and then interlinking it with the instrumentation that this person's using, the data, like facilities, like all these other sort of, aspects that a research facility might, like want to do. And like I think that's also sort of another interesting, like way to interlink these things. So
I threw in the chat a link to the RDA report that came out on persistent identifiers for instruments as well.
Thanks, Carly. Okay, well, with that, we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to stop the discussion and just very quickly throw up the summary slide, which, doesn't say a huge amount because I think the key points are fairly clear from the session overall. The first is just the session that we're planning on submitting to P27 is going to be that update on the full set of case studies we're collecting. So you can look forward to a focus on that, hopefully, especially given how many pitch strategies are emerging from all those areas and regions that we didn't collect case studies from before. And then ultimately, I mean, I think the main point that I tried to drive home is funders can help drive forward PID strategies through PID adoption. I don't have anything to add to that, but we've learned a lot, I think, as a group about a lot of the nuance, sort of how can that happen in your local and regional context? Where are local persistent identifiers or identifiers tied in? Really interesting challenge for ROAR there, for example, in the Portuguese context, where it was just not at the level that is needed for a PID strategy there. So, you know, it's certainly, I think we have a lot that we can all learn from each other. So I don't know if my co-chairs have anything else they would like to add before we close down the session.
No, thank you, John, and thank you to the presenters. That's all I've got to say. And yes, if you're not involved in the National PID Strategies Interest Group, please do get involved. And if you want to write a case study or update an existing one, do that too. And if you want any help or assistance, be in touch.
Yes,
Hannah,
this is
please.
a very important point. I just want to drive home. We are collecting case studies until the end of this month. If you have not been approached and you would like to, we would love to have that.